Story 1. Damp rubber and wood chips remind me of the Year 2 school playground when I was a child. Story 2. Cigarette smoke is bad, but it still feels oddly nostalgic because many members of my family used to smoke. They have all since quit. Story 3. Honeysuckle and petrichor. The windows are open on a rainy summer night in Georgia, and my sisters and I are listening to the weekly Top 40. Barbie's Ode to Plastic and Grape Popsicles. I'm 5 and playing after school. L'Oreal hair conditioner and VO5 shampoo. I'm at my grandma's house. So many beautiful memories. Story 4. A nearby factory emitted a butterscotch scent, so the whole neighborhood always smelled of it. Story 5. Meatloaf and tomato gravy, chalk dust, and permanent scented markers. Story 6. Coppertone suntan lotion and the smell of a new plastic air mattress as you blow it up. Story 7. The smell of lilacs always takes me back to summers as a kid in New Hampshire. Story 8. I like the smell of books and gymnasiums in schools. Growing up, most schools I attended were built in the 1960s and 1970s, even though I was a child in the 1980s and 1990s, so that smell is ingrained in me. Story 9. It must have been the mid-1990s opening packs of baseball cards. Maybe it was the smell of the ink. I don't know. It was a waste of money, but we had so much fun. Story 10. Betty Crocker yellow cake with canned chocolate frosting. Story 11. Chlorine. The distinct smell you get from a swimming pool. Story 12. I passed a woman at work a few years ago. Once she was out of earshot, I said to my coworker, "Did you smell her perfume?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "It smelled like the stinker He-Man action figure from the 1980s. We reminisced about that for a while. Apparently, whatever they used on that action figure is a fairly common perfume ingredient. Story 13. The earthy smell of the playground the day after it rains. Story 14. A damp, chilly September morning has a specific smell. I swear. Story 15. The perfume was worn by the first girl I ever made out with about 28 years ago. About 2 years ago, a small company released a hand soap that smelled exactly like that perfume, and I was instantly sent back to the lichen-covered picnic table at a mutual friend's house where we had made out. I felt embarrassed again when we went into the house afterward and that friend's mother commented on my choice of lipstick shade. Story 16. My mother told me many times that, when she became pregnant with me, she was put off by the smell of gardenias blooming around our house. She never wanted to smell another gardenia, and I have never smelled a gardenia without thinking of her. Story 17. Taboo perfume. My aunt wore it, and I adored both her and the scent. She has been gone for a while, but I keep a bottle in her memory. West Texas native. The smell of petrichor. When rain approached, we would smell the feed lots west of town. It was not a pleasant smell, but it almost always signaled rain, which was an event here, and when the rain arrived it was petrichor time, a gorgeous smell. Incense of the West, pinyon fragrance. We vacationed in New Mexico a lot when I was growing up, and the smell of burning pinyon would always take me back to childhood. My dad burned it all the time. Story 18. Barnes & Noble is the best smell on the planet. Story 19. The scent of roses reminds me of making perfume with rose petals when I was in nursery. My grandmother showed me how, and it brings back lovely memories of us making it together. Story 20. This is going to sound strange, but hear me out. When I was a small Irish child in Massachusetts, my older, much larger cousin jumped on me and slammed me onto the sidewalk with his full weight on my head. I suffered a concussion and there was blood everywhere. The smell of that event is ingrained in my mind, chemical and sharp. Today, certain cleaning solutions have that smell and bring me right back to my emergency room visit. It is surreal. Story 21. Weirdly, the mix of dried blood and instant mashed potatoes reminds me of the hospital. Thanks, trauma. Story 22. Walking into a candy store. The sweet smell instantly takes me back to being a kid. Story 23. Lavender grew in somebody's garden down my road, and I used to pick it on my way to school. Story 24. Grandma stored crayons in a coffee tin. I love that smell. Story 25. Clove chewing gum was always in my grandmother's purse. She passed away when I was 9. Story 26. Old books, paper, and crayons. My grandma had a closet specifically designated for coloring books, crayons, and toys for us kids. The smell when we opened it was delicious. Some sections of our small local library bring that smell to mind, but it is hard to come by these days. Story 27. The smell of urine in an alley in downtown Los Angeles is a sweet memory. Story 28. If I walk into a pizza restaurant and it smells just like the one we went to when I was a kid, King Pizza, which closed a long time ago, then I know it is legitimate. Story 29. Skunk. Our neighbor's dog was sprayed when I was younger. I will never forget that smell. Story 30. Honeydew Melon Yankee Candle. It reminds me of a hurricane party my parents held. The power was out, and they had this candle burning. Story 31. The smell of butterscotch always takes me back to waiting patiently for my dad to finish talking to his insurance agent while I tried to find Waldo on every page of every book. Story 32. Dial soap takes me back to first grade in Miss Fitzpatrick's class. Story 33. Percolator coffee, bacon and eggs, homemade biscuits, and cigarette smoke were the smells of my grandmother's kitchen. A hint of Brute, English leather, and women's talcum powder lingered around the edges. Story 34. Corned beef, sweet and sour cabbage, rye bread, and a hint of chlorine. I remember summers at my grandmother's house after spending the entire day in the pool. It was a bonus when she made a noodle kugel. Story 35. The Scholastic Book Fair. I can't describe the smell. It just happens sometimes. Story 36. Blood and sawdust. My father owned a butcher shop, and in the 1970s and 1980s they would cover the floor with sawdust to catch the blood and sweep it up each night. Story 37. On the rare occasions nowadays when I am near a car from the 1970s or 1980s, the exhaust fumes instantly take me back to childhood. Story 38. Petrichor. The playground at my elementary school had tiny, rounded pebbles on top of dirt instead of rubber or bark dust, and it was the most evocative scent you could imagine. When I smell it in the real world, it is never as intense, but it reminds me of the days when a swing felt like flying and everyone was my best friend except Alex. He was a dick. Story 39. Play-Doh. Scented pencils. The smell of rubber balls used for kickball. Story 40. My mother bleached everything. Nothing seemed clean unless it had been. Story 41. My mother's potato soup has been a staple since I was a child, and every time she makes it, it takes me back to the walk-in basement we used to live in. Story 42. The smell of the video store, the video home system tapes with styrofoam inserts. I took a deep whiff to savor it while deciding which Ernest classic to rent. Rest in peace, Jim. Story 43. The smell of elementary school. Erasers mixed with farts. Story 44. I grew up in Buffalo, New York. The General Mills factory alternated between roasting oats for Cheerios and Lucky Charms, and you could smell the difference in the air. I always made my mom roll down the windows when we drove downtown. Even in winter, it was awesome. Story 45. The smell of elementary school is a combination of the cafeteria floor, erasers, and colored pencils. It's hard to describe exactly. I used to think this was just how my school smelled until my son started school in a different city and his school smelled exactly the same. Story 46. Puffed rice has a carnival smell. Story 47. I was wearing whatever deodorant I had when I first played The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time in 1998. I played that game obsessively as a teenager. Story 48. Crayon. Construction paper. The smell of a diner. That old-fashioned red lipstick. Cinnamon-coated potpourri. Hay and horse manure. The smell of the sea. We ate at a fish restaurant called Flanagan's. Story 49. This is very niche, but where I grew up there was a place called Archery Headquarters, which was, as you guessed, an archery store and an indoor range. It had such a distinct smell that I recognized it for the first time in over 30 years when I was at a thrift store. Story 50. The combination of Barbicide, hairspray, hairdryer heat, and Clinique aromatics in 1980s hair salons. My mum is a hairdresser. Story 51. The stagnant water smell from Disneyland's Pirates of the Caribbean isn't pleasant, but it always brings me back to childhood. Story 52. Cherry Almond Soap. The smell reminds me of the Vidal Sassoon shampoo they kept in the outdoor shower at the beach house where I stayed as a child. Story 53. I did not know what my much older brother's house smelled like until I went off to college. It turned out to be stale marijuana smoke. Story 54. I was 4 or 5 years old, sitting on a booster seat at the fish camp with warm hush puppies. That was when I learned it is coleslaw, not cold slaw. Story 55. I love putting a turkey stock on to simmer at night and waking to its smell in the morning. Story 56. Mothballs and petrichor. Mothballs remind me of heading to our cabin on the first day of summer. We used them to pack away the towels and blankets that had been stored over the winter. Petrichor reminds me of long days playing baseball with my friends on our cul-de-sac. You could always watch storms roll in, and we played until the rain started or we saw lightning. Story 57. Hot asphalt as the rain begins reminds me of playing outside in summer while a shower passed by. Crayons remind me of my first day of kindergarten when I picked up my pencil box and found it upside down, spilling crayons and pencils all over the floor. A sixth grader helped me pick them up. Story 58. My mom smells nice, and she makes me feel safe when I hug her and take a whiff. Then she opens her mouth and says something hypercritical, and I feel as if I have been shot 1,200 times. Story 59. There is a way Christmas candles smelled in the 1970s that I occasionally smell now. Story 60. Chlorine smells like an indoor pool. It's like being instantly warped through space and time back to a newly conscious 3-year-old. I love neuroscience. Story 61. I guess old wood and carpet. I have no clue what made my great-grandmother's house smell like it did, and unlike most smells, I can almost summon them from memory, but that particular smell has to be present to notice. I was in an old Chinese restaurant in Los Angeles and it had that same smell. It was unbelievable. Story 62. That old lady smell. I remember it from my childhood. Story 63. Specifically, freshly vacuumed carpet with the windows open. Story 64. At car dealerships, I especially liked the garage area. My dad was a mechanic for years when I was a kid, and I loved visiting him at work. Now they would not even let kids run around back there like I did. Story 65. There is a distinct scent of smoke that I only smelled as a child on trips to Missouri. I found an incense that mimics it almost perfectly and always reminds me of those times. Story 66. Someone's breath after they have just drunk peppermint tea always reminds me of my maternal grandparents. Story 67. Strawberry chapstick smells like the strawberry shortcake dolls I had. Story 68. Saddles and bridles mixed with the musky smell of sweat, dirt, and horsehair. This is my absolute favorite smell. Story 69. Not my childhood, but my high school years. I recently used a Neutrogena makeup wipe I used all the time then, and its scent sent me back to an exact moment with all the feelings I had. Story 70. I haven't actually smelled it in about 35 years, but I remember the Ninja Turtle bubble bath that came in a container resembling a sewer grate. I can still vividly recall that smell and would gladly buy any product available now that smells like it. Story 71. When I smoke a joint and drink a large double-double Tim Hortons coffee in Vancouver, the combined taste reminds me of a sticky toffee pudding from when I was 5 in England at the school cafeteria. Story 72. The smell in the store where you buy carpets and rugs is wonderful. I rarely go in. The last time I did, the scent catapulted me back to my early years. It is such a nice smell. Bookstores, too. I love that smell. It makes me feel young again, like when I read Goosebumps. Story 73. We never lit candles while growing up except on birthdays. The smoke from blown-out candles always reminds me of those celebrations. Story 74. A freshly lit cigarette. Sour punch straws. Strawberry and blueberry. Rest in peace, Mom. I love and miss you every day. Story 75. There is a certain type of secret brand deodorant that makes me feel like everything is going to be okay. I am not sure which one it is, though. Story 76. The smell of fennel, the stuff they use in salads, is distinct. I was in a bad car accident while driving through a patch of it. Now every time I smell it, the memories come back, even though I have moved on from the trauma. Story 77. Smoke and whiskey. I guess I grew up in a normalized drinking culture or whatever. My granny would get totally wasted and we would play whatever game show was on television. Mostly Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. I remember thinking she was a genius for it. I grew up fetching the doctor's pills for her every morning and thought that was totally normal. Story 78. Cumin and cooking pinto beans. Vanilla extract. Secondhand smoke. Old rooms where people used to smoke. The smell has seeped into the walls. Dampness among pine trees. Sunburnt pine needles. Salty sea breeze. Wicker baskets and pine cones. Craft store decorations. Strange potpourri. Sage bonfrite sausage. Freshly cut grass. Story 79. If there is a men's perfume that reminds me of many things. Story 80. Strawberry-scented lotions bring me back to my elementary school library. Story 81. I had mint custard with cake the other day, something I had not tasted since I was very young at school, and it took me right back to that time. Story 82. The smell of pipe tobacco reminds me of my pawpaw. When he used to smoke, I would always smell it and immediately think of him. Story 83. I used hand sanitizer, especially high-alcohol brands such as Germex, all the time in kindergarten. Story 84. Weirdly enough, the rare combination of Moroccan leather treated with cow urine and freshly made tea brings me instantly back to 1995, to the streets of Granada, Spain, where I had my first job at age 15. Story 85. Sunburnt grass and wild plants between concrete turned yellow from uninterrupted sunlight and extreme heat. Suddenly I am 12 again, walking to the beach in the afternoon on an abandoned highway. The stressors of home are forgotten. The exit date felt unreal. Story 86. My grandparents lived overseas in a town whose name translates to Heathertown. Heather was everywhere, and the smell brings me right back. Story 87. Fresh asphalt reminds me of Kings Island. Not fresh as in poured that day, but like a week old, baking in the sun. We went to Kings Island in Cincinnati a lot while growing up and loved every second of it. I feel like they resurfaced the whole place every year. Story 88. Insulin, formaldehyde, and the scent of many fresh flowers. My mother has diabetes, and my father was a mortician. Story 89. Lilacs. My mom always had a small bush planted at every air base where my dad was stationed. Story 90. Sugared toast. I don't know what it's called. It takes me back because my mom used to make it for our snacks. Story 91. Celery, onions, butter, and sage sautéing on Thanksgiving morning. Story 92. If I ever found it, I would make a candle from it and sell only one. Story 93. Ham and cheese sandwich with mustard. Takes me back 35 years to preschool. My lunchbox smelled like that. Story 94. Pipe tobacco. My grandfather smoked a pipe and I love the smell. I wish there were incense scented like pipe tobacco that did not create secondhand smoke. Story 95. I do not know, but if I ever found it, I would make a candle from it. I would not sell all of it. I would probably sell only one. Story 96. Shalimar perfume is definitely a grandmother's scent, but it has a soft baby wipe note. It reminds me of the holidays of many hugs, and I always smelled it on my grandmother's and aunts. I splurged and bought a large bottle to remind myself of a nicer time in life. Story 97. In the 1980s, there were little yellow ball-headed figures called Knuffles. I had one that wore a toque and had a bandage on his cheek, and it came with a small red wagon. A quick Google search says it was named Frankie. The vinyl used to make it off-gassed for years. Every once in a while I catch the scent of new vinyl off-gassing in a store, and it immediately takes me back to being 7 or 8 years old in my parents' living room. Yellowing curtains, a bay window, and our huge stereo system underneath. It was a 5 to 6 foot furniture-style record player and 8-track player with speakers on each end. I used to play on top of it with Frankie, Skeletor, Michelangelo from the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Grimlock, and Antaeus Deinonychus from Dino Riders. Story 98. Cherry pipe tobacco takes me back to my slumber parties with my cousins. I always struggled to sleep when I was away from home, but Uncle John would be up late on the porch puffing his corncob pipe. He would share his bag of Runts candy while we sat in the cold and watched Mystery Science Theater 3000 or The Twilight Zone until I dozed off on the sofa. Story 99. The smell of hot asphalt right after a summer thunderstorm instantly takes me back to being 8 years old, running barefoot on the driveway and feeling the steam rise up. It is the literal scent of summer vacation. Story 100. Cardamom spice. My grandmother used to bring my family fresh cardamom bread. Story 101. I have come across a couple of things that smell like this, and they take me back to my 10-year-old self immediately. Story 102. Black raspberries, elderberries, lily of the valley, Bulgarian rose, bluebells. We had patches of black raspberries and elderberry bushes at home. We made jelly and other things from them. Miss Dior essence smells like cooking jelly in the kitchen, with the windows open and a little floral breeze passing through. Lily of the Valley was one of my mom's favorite flowers, and we had them around the house and yard. Lily of the Valley Elves is a joyous perfume featuring that flower and always makes me smile when I smell it. We had mounds of bluebells growing in my grandma's backyard. The only perfume I've smelled with bluebell is Ormond Jane Babylonia. It was an accidental blind by my husband made in his sleep. Fortunately, it smells wonderful on us. Bulgarian rose is the scent of the Petal Place Girls makeup kit I got for Christmas when I was little. It is relaxing and makes me happy. I have a perfume that is pure Bulgarian rose. It was the gateway fragrance to my current collection. Story 103. Sweet pea body lotion takes me straight back to middle school. Story 104. My strangest is the smell of the toilet bowl deodorizer my grandmother used. I have no idea which one it was, but sometimes I catch a whiff of something similar, usually on an older woman. A stale smoke smell in a car with leather seats. The exhaust smell from a snowmobile. Story 105. Dust from the furnace during the first heating in the fall. The scent of trembling aspen and poplar when tent caterpillars metamorphose in the spring. Indoor hockey and skating rinks. Outdoor pools. Peanut butter and banana sandwich. Bologna and onion sandwich. Silver willow. Creosote on wooden railway ties. Sweet peas. Moldy wheat in old granaries. Homemade mustard pickle. The first whiff of an open juicy fruit gum wrapper. Story 106. Peonies. The farm where I grew up had 2 large peony bushes along the driveway. I loved their scent. Story 107. When I was a little kid in the mid-1950s, there was a national effort to reduce mosquitoes in the summer. Dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane was one of the most powerful insecticides on the market. It is now banned in many countries because of its effects on the environment and animal populations. State-owned pickup trucks had huge fans in their beds and 55-gallon drums of dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane mixed with diesel fuel. Someone riding in the truck bed would hook a hose from the drum to the fan and spray a thick mist into the air. My buddies and I would ride our bikes to these trucks and race to see who could ride into the mist first. We pretended we were riding in a cloud. This continued until the 55-gallon drum was empty and the truck returned for more. At the end of the day, we all smelled like we had worked in an oil refinery. The diesel odor permeated our clothes, skin, and anything else it touched. The smell of diesel exhaust still brings back memories of long summer days with my friends, riding our bikes, playing ball, and hanging out until the streetlights came on. The innocence and personal freedom of the 1950s are gone. I am 77 and apparently have not suffered any effects from dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane, except mosquitoes almost never bite or even land on me. I always wonder if it is in my DNA. My wife, who gets bitten before she gets out the door, is always jealous. Story 108. Cow manure reminds me of nights in the barn helping my dad with chores. Story 109. 1. Mustiness and the faint smell of gasoline remind me of my grandparents' garage in upstate New York. 2. Hot engine oil, gasoline, and exhaust remind me of my first motorcycle, a 1978 Honda GL 1000. Maybe not childhood, but definitely nostalgic. Story 110. Royal brand ginseng vials. I could never put my finger on why they smelled nostalgic until I had my reckoning with Jack Daniels and realized they smelled like my dad growing up. We both cannot stand even a whiff of that smell anymore. Story 111. Today, in the middle of the grocery store, someone walked by wearing the same perfume my third-grade teacher wore. It has been 24 years since I smelled it. Story 112. It doesn't really exist anymore, but now and then I get a whiff of mimeograph paper. It was used in school to make our lesson sheets before modern copy machines in the 1960s. Story 113. My brother and I were fascinated by world disasters. When we were both under 10, we had a scratch and sniff book about the Black Plague. Flash forward to our 20s. My grandmother gave me a dollar store candle labeled Fields, with no scent description. I asked him to smell it. He smelled it, looked me dead in the eye and said, "That's plague smell." Story 114. Freshly mowed grass, 4,711 cologne. Sheets dried on a clothesline and freshly ground coffee. Story 115. Pinot Clubman powder used at the barbershop after your haircut. Story 116. Freshly turned soil in a field or garden. I grew up in Iowa. Spring smelled like dirt. Story 117. Cold, clean, snowy air. When I was a kid, winter was sparkly and fresh, and the air smelled cold and clean. Story 118. Chlorine. We had an in-ground pool and spent about 95% of our summers in or around it. I had an inflatable bottle boat. It was Jim Beam or Jack Daniels, I believe, but it was the coolest pool toy ever. Story 119. Johnson & Johnson baby lotion smells like sleepovers at grandma's house. Story 120. Cherry almond. I will always associate that classic Jergens scent with my mother from childhood. Synthetic banana. I associate this with now and later candy, which was my favorite throughout childhood. Cigar smoke. My dad smoked a Churchill cigar every night when I was growing up. I do not particularly like the scent, but the memories are fond. Drakkar Noir, Kouros, and Polo Green. I was in high school during the 1980s and was surrounded by teenagers who wore way too much of each. Story 121. Not long ago I sniffed something and said it reminded me of my Nagimama, my grandma. Someone told me it was mothballs. Story 122. My grandmother's breakfasts were huge, filling the whole table with one big meal. I missed them. They were the best. Story 123. Horse manure immediately transports me back to being in a barn. I was very into horseback riding. I actually like the smell. It is oddly comforting. Story 124. The burnt marshmallow smell when the ballast of a fluorescent light goes out. Mr. Bubble Bath has a remarkably similar scent, but I can't think of the product at the moment. Story 125. I remember the smell of freshly dug peanuts in the air during harvest season. I moved away and have missed that smell ever since. Story 126. Cigarettes. I miss smoky bowling alleys. I dislike that businesses can no longer choose to allow smoking and that patrons cannot decide whether to go. There should be some exceptions. Story 127. Mock orange bushes instantly take me back because we had some around my childhood home. Story 128. The smell of mulch. When I was in elementary school, as summer neared, my parents would have a truckload of mulch dumped in the driveway. Riding the bus home with the windows down on a Friday afternoon, I could smell it and felt a sense of dread that I would spend what in my kid brain felt like a whole Saturday but was really only a few hours helping spread mulch. I hated doing it. Story 129. The shower steam and Polo remind me of waiting to get into the bathroom after my older stepbrother before school. Story 130. Diesel and grease on a farm in the summer. Bags of dry powdered milk for calves. Story 131. Smoke and leather. My dad was a firefighter and would wear a leather jacket when he came home after his shift. Story 132. Labatt Blue on a cold night in a parking lot during high school. Story 133. I smoked cannabis. It's hide-and-seek time at my dad's, and then I get to play Special Operations Command, laughing out loud. Story 134. Petrichor. The smell of old cigarettes mixed with cologne. Fruit-scented markers that matched their color. Purple smelled like grape, orange smelled like orange, and so on. Story 135. Woodruff, my dad would pick it when we were walking and let it dry in the kitchen. It's just so comforting and brings back memories of those walks. Story 136. The smell of Marlboro smoke from someone outside brought an instant flashback to the 80s. I could not place it in any specific memory, and I do not smoke and cannot stand the smell when others do. But when it is a Marlboro carried on the wind, it is like a 4th of July cookout. Story 137. Government buildings in the early morning. Whatever mixture of chemicals the janitors use has not changed, and it smells exactly like my elementary school did when we arrived. Story 138. Boiled chicken with thyme and rosemary. Way too much seasoning. I was at the tail end of a week with the flu, a really bad case, and had been out of school all week with repeated vomiting. Grandma decided to cook boiled chicken, and the steam woke me up. I spent the next hour in the bathroom, with the window open in the middle of winter, vomiting on an empty stomach. Story 139. I own a very strong perfume that I wear only once or twice in the 5 years I've had it. Recently, I caught a whiff when someone nearby tested it in a store. It instantly transported me back to family reunions and the beach house we rented every summer. Then I realized it was the bathroom I remembered. Oddly, only the bathroom smelled like that. The only explanation I could think of was that the scent came from a cleaner or soap. At the following family Christmas, I let everyone smell the perfume and they agreed, but none of us could identify the exact product, so I will probably never know what it was. Story 140. Blueberry pie reminds me of going up north to Lewiston and spending the summer at our cabin on the lake. We would pick the berries, and my great-grandmother would make pie and blueberry pancakes. Story 141. That cheap white musk perfume you could get at Walmart, Body Fantasies, I think it's called. Yep, I'm 5 and it's the early 2000s again. Story 142. Scratch and sniff stickers. This will always be my answer. Story 143. There is a certain Yankee Candle scent that takes me back to playing Final Fantasy VIII for the first time. I get whiffs of a similar scent in perfumes and it always sends me back in time. Story 144. I was born in a different country. Whenever I visit, the scent of the plants there reminds me of my childhood. Story 145. Petrichor. It's an odd one, I know, but I have memories that it links to. Story 146. Lynx, Java, and Africa. I grew up surrounded by it. Story 147. High-temperature Greece, pine sap, and Copenhagen tobacco. My dad was a logger in the South. Story 148. Wood cleaner. It had a cherry almond scent. The first house my parents bought had hardwood floors, and my mom was so invested in polishing them. Story 149. My mom loved Bath and Body Works cucumber melon. I don't think I'll forget the smell. Story 150. There is a fragrance my grandmother used to try to cover up the cigarette smoke from her habit of smoking 4 packs a day. Whenever I run into it, I am immediately transported back to her living room in 1992. Story 151. Poinsettias have such a disgusting smell that it takes me back to kindergarten. I associate that smell with my first headache and the fluorescent pink of rose art crayons, even though poinsettias are red. Story 152. Honeysuckle. My grandparents had huge bushes outside their house when my brother, cousins, and I were growing up. It was the background smell while we played outside. We have distinct memories of my grandma showing us how to pull the nectar from the flowers. I miss her a lot. Story 153. My grandmother had ferns growing on the hitch of her mobile home. They had a very distinct, powerful scent that was minty and earthy. I have only smelled that scent a couple of times since I grew up. Story 154. A fresh pack of Pokemon cards takes me right back to the schoolyard when we used to trade. Story 155. Fresh lumber and cigarette smoke take me back to my grandparents' house. Story 156. Saline. Not the greatest memory, but its scent takes me instantly back to the day hospital. I can actually smell and taste the saline flushes used for intravenous lines. Story 157. My grandparents both worked at the post office. I would go with my grandmother on Saturday mornings and play with the equipment and packages. It was a very small town, so no one minded a child hanging out in the back. Story 158. There was a musty, damp cave smell from the root cellar of the house I grew up in. Its limestone walls were porous and smelled of concentrated moss. One day, as I stepped off my front porch, I caught a whiff and was transported back 38 years. Story 159. The smell of freshly cut grass reminds me of when my grandfather used to mow the lawn. Story 160. Coffee brewing takes me back to being dropped off at the babysitter's house. She always brewed a pot in the morning, and the smell still turns my stomach. I am 54 now and cannot stand it. Flavored coffee is okay, but regular coffee makes me sick. Story 161. Growing up the way I did, roaches had their own smell. Story 162. Smoke from a campfire. Being a Boy Scout was so much fun, and our troop was very active in camping regardless of the weather. Story 163. Aquanet hairspray was everywhere in the 1950s and 1960s. Story 164. New sneakers immediately make me think of the first day of school. Story 165. For me, it is the smell of an action figure when you break it free from the plastic bubble. It is a gloriously toxic cocktail of cheap plastic and paint. Story 166. My first house's furnace turned on. It was a bit dank, but it smelled like home. Story 167. Grapefruit juice always reminds me of preschool and kindergarten, and Luster's pink oil hair lotion does, too. Story 168. Tumbleweed reminds me of riding motorcycles with my family in the California desert. Story 169. We had a movie projector and a pull-down screen. It had a distinctive smell whenever we used it to watch home movies. I came across it while cleaning out Mom's house after she died, and sure enough the smell was still there. Unfortunately, no one wanted it and it was thrown away. Story 170. The water from the sprinkler reminds me of summers spent at my grandmother's house. So many good memories. Story 171. Patchily, not my childhood so much as my teenage years. Story 172. Sometimes I walk outside and smell a peculiar scent of burning white pebbles. It is hard to explain, but no matter how much I travel, I catch that whiff every 2 to 3 years. When I do, I cherish the moment because it fades so quickly. I am in love with that scent. Story 173. Original Old Spice aftershave. It takes me back to being a child and to my grandfather getting ready for church. Story 174. I used to live near a McCain French fry factory. I can still smell it even though it was 45 years ago. Story 175. When the cake mixer has an electrical odor, I get to lick the beaters. Story 176. Children's finger paint takes me immediately back to preschool. Story 177. Fresh cut grass. My father was a preacher when I was very young. Every Sunday afternoon, the parishioners would come by with food and we would have a simple yard party. My dad would get out the riding lawnmower, and my sister and I would take turns cutting the grass. Then we took turns sitting on a towel on top of the ice cream maker while my dad made peach ice cream for everyone. The people loved him. I am always happy when I smell fresh cut grass and get a hankering for ice cream. Story 178. Edible cherry-flavored underwear. My dad partied a lot, was on a television show with his girlfriend who worked as a sex worker, and even proposed to her. The scent of that fake cherry takes me back to when I was 10, finding them in the living room and wanting to eat them because I thought they were candy. Story 179. I used to take walks with my grandma. A fern grows in an underpass and smells herbal, for lack of a better description. I went back to my childhood home, and it is the only place that smells like that. Life is crazy. Story 180. The smell of the ice cream truck, like whatever smoke comes out of it, reminds me of when I was 9. Story 181. Sawdust. Grandpa was a woodworker. I also cherish my mother's split pea soup and homemade whole wheat bread. She gave me the recipe by shrugging and saying she got it out of the Tassajara bread book, so I bought a copy and make it regularly. Story 182. Onions and celery sweating in butter always remind me of my dad making filling for Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner. Chantilly perfume was my mother's favorite. It did not make my dad's eyes water. Love's Baby Soft Body Spray. I loved that light scent and wish we could buy it again. I remember chalk dust and chicken noodle soup on my first day of first grade. Story 183. Irish cream creamer in my coffee. I do not care for the taste, but I use it occasionally because it reminds me of making coffee for my mother when I was a teenager. Story 184. A wood fire. My grandmother used to cook on a wood-fired stove when I was a kid in the 1970s. When I smell it, it unlocks amazing memories. Story 185. A wood stove reminds me of my great-grandparents' house when I was a kid. Story 186. I do not know what it is, but the elevator in my grandmother's building has an odor. Story 187. Crayola crayons, erasers, potpourri, and My Little Pony toys. Story 188. Old English cologne. My grandfather wore it religiously, and he died suddenly when I was a child. 15 years later, I caught a whiff, and it felt like I had been hit by a Mack truck. Story 189. Vanilla. A guy I was friends with in high school wore a really nice vanilla scent that did not smell fake. So whenever I smell it, I think of him. He was a cool guy. Story 190. Glade Clean Linen and Bath and Body Works Black Cherry Merlot take me back to childhood summers. I remember playing Abe's Odd World with my brothers, eating snacks, and washing our hands as we passed the automatic scent sprayer that activated every 30 minutes. Story 191. I can't tell. I was born with anosmia, so I have never smelled anything. Laughing out loud. Story 192. I used oil to lubricate the bearings in my skateboards. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.